Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Cybersecurity Cybertruck Edition workshop by the Q Project. My name's Solomon Denning, and tonight I'm going to be doing a quick workshop about firewalls to give you a basic understanding of what they are and how you can make sure that your home network and your computers are protected. So first off, what is a firewall? It's a network security device. It monitors the incoming traffic and the outgoing traffic, and then it blocks traffic based on a set of firewall rules, which we'll go into later in this workshop. They've been around for more than 25 years, and they're really just basic rules for creating trust and untrusted people within networks and the internet, because the internet is massive and you don't want anyone having access to your own home network or your own business network. So you need to have ways of trusting people. And for whether it's hardware or software, firewall is both. Most of the time you see it as software on like a home level. But if you're looking at like businesses and server rooms, they have tons of hardware for their firewall. And it's also both. So you can think of your firewall as like the first line of defense for your home network. And if you split that down into the two basic categories, you have a network-based firewall and a host-based one. The network-based one is the one that is more familiar for like business enterprise. It's going to be a dedicated piece of hardware that sits within the network, and it can be on a LAN or a WAN. WAN is wide area network, LAN is local area network. So a LAN would be like your home, WAN would be like an entire city. So you have this software that can be on general purpose hardware, which would probably be like on a home level or like a smaller level. And then big businesses like Google, they most likely have special purpose firewall hardware dedicated just for what they want it to do. And then that will sit on their server. Most of these network based firewalls, they provide additional services. They have like the DHCP, VPN abilities built in, a bunch of different services that come in handy for networking. And then if we look down at the host based firewall, this is what's more common on like your home network or on your individual devices. So this is a firewall that's deployed directly on a host device. This is what you would see, say, in your Windows firewall settings or your Mac firewall settings, or even technically your router. It could be considered a host-based firewall in some cases. But this controls the network traffic, and it also controls computing resources. It makes sure that like there isn't malicious activity that's abusing your computer's resources. And these usually run as like a daemon or a service, something in the background of your operating system or another like dedicated piece of hardware. If you look at these pictures, the one at the very top in the middle, this is what a server or like a small example of a server firewall would look like. This is like a 1 unit one that fits in one of these slots. And hopefully you're able to read what it says here on the side of each, but you can see that this firewall is positioned like in the middle of this server rack. If you went to a business, this is like an idea of how it would look. When you look at your home network, you don't see this because most of the features you need for a home network are not on a server rack. They're just built into your router in all in one piece of hardware and software. So next, I'm gonna go over some of the like the basic types of hardware. I got this straight from Cisco, so this does well for what we plan to do in the future with CCNA because people you need to know what different types of firewalls are out there. But to start with, the old one is proxy firewalls. So this is basically just creating a proxy between two networks. So it's like creating a connection based on trust. One network knows it can connect to another, the other one connects back, and it's a firewall because it's allowing trusted people to communicate, but then no one else on the internet can communicate through that means. These have some security issues, and so in current days, this one on the right, a stateful inspection firewall, is the most traditional one. And this is the one that, if you know anything about firewalls, this is the one that you're gonna recognize because stateful inspection firewalls, they block traffic based on the state, the port, and protocol. So this is the idea of saying this IP address on, say, port 80 cannot be accessed internally. So if someone tries to access it from the outside, they wouldn't be able to. And I'll go into more depth on that later on in these slides. Another thing that stateful inspection firewalls do is they monitor activity of the opening and closing connections. So they can see all the connections that are open. If you have this set up on your device or like your individual device, then your device will just be tracking what connections it has open for itself. On a router level, it's going to be tracking all the connections open on every device inside the local network. And like I've been mentioning before, filter decisions are made based on admin rules, basically the firewall rules, which I'm going to get into later on, and they disallow connections. Some other types of firewall are the UTM firewall. This one basically takes stateful inspection firewalls and adds another layer of intrusion prevention or antivirus. So this allows for the firewall to also be able to, on top of blocking connections that it has disallowed, it can check for malicious files and malicious content and packets and all that and prevent those from accessing the network as well. In current days, we have on the right here the next generation firewall. These are any firewalls that hold a certain standard above the normal. And these are things like adding the intrusion prevention, being able to control and see what type of apps are risky and blocking them, basically adding more features that are useful for the user to block things that so that they don't have to do it manually. And then coming here to the left, the other one is a threat focused NGFW. This is basically just a next generation firewall, but with way more threat focused attributes involved with it as well. So these type of firewalls, they know what assets are most at risk. This works great for, say, your system is compromised. It has the ability to clean up that compromised part really quickly compared to old firewalls because it stores a lot more data, keeps a better eye on things, and then it can help the network team be able to handle it more quickly. And then lastly, another type of firewall is virtual firewalls. These are firewalls that are put up on like cloud services and all that. And I won't go into too much depth about those, but I want to let you know that they exist. And so next up is I want to briefly touch on the difference between firewall and antivirus because sometimes these are thought of as the same thing, even though they aren't. And it's mainly because sometimes they do the same functionality or they combine themselves. So you should know that firewall and antivirus are not the same thing, but oftentimes you can get antivirus software that includes additional firewalls on top of your operating system firewall and your router firewall. So for antivirus versus firewall, implementation is antivirus is always just software. And like I mentioned before, firewall includes the hardware and the software. The other main difference is antiviruses, they scan for corrupt files, malicious files, and a firewall is blocking this before it even reaches the network. So a firewall deals more with making sure that whatever IP address wants to enter your network to give data or to take data, that it's allowed to do so. And then antivirus is there to back that up and see, okay, someone got in that wasn't intended to and they left corrupt files. Let me clean that up. So yeah, so antivirus is internal and external threats. Firewall is just external. They also deal with different counterattacks. Antivirus, once you remove the malware, the person that gave you the malware typically doesn't have another option to go with on a firewall. If you're not using up-to-date next-gen firewalls, like I'll mention in a little bit, I think 1 or 2 slides after this, they can spoof their IP address to create a workaround. So this would be faking it and making your firewall think that you're an IP address that is allowed to access the network internally, and so you can bypass firewall that way. And so for those of you that wanna know of options for antiviruses that include firewall, I just made a quick list that I found on the internet. Most of these big name ones like Bitdefender, Avast, and Nord, or I believe that that should be Norton, not Nord, but they all they have their free antivirus, but if you wanna their firewall, you have to pay for it, and all of these are about, like, 30 to $60 annually if someone is willing to pay for that. And then down here, I've given some free firewall/antivirus. And hold on, let me check the chat real quick. Yeah, I'm getting in the chat someone's Armand saying that you should stay away from Avast. They sell data. So yeah, it's up. I would say it's up to you too. Before you pay for any antivirus/firewall, you should check what kind of business they are and whether it's worthwhile to pay for it. All right, so now we're gonna get into some of the good stuff. So firewall rules, what are these? The rules determine what traffic your firewall is going to allow and what it's going to block. So this is set up by an admin or someone on the network that has the ability to change these settings. And you want to be able to access your firewall rules across each device on its own and on the network in general. So the way you could think of this is on your home network, you have your router blocking everything besides what you would want allowed. And on every device, say your kid has a laptop, your kid doesn't need to have all these additional ports open. So on your kid's laptop, you can tell the firewall block everything that's not needed. And then your kid's laptop will have additional firewall protections beyond what your router's doing. So you want to make sure that you know the difference between your hosts and then your router's firewall, even though they function on the same level. And so to create firewall rules, the most basic things you need to know is you need to know your traffic source, destination, what service. So this would be like the port or service. Service and port relate to the same thing. So HTTP is a service and it uses a port 80. So you need to know both of those, or mainly just the port. An example of how you would like phrase a firewall rule to like tell someone else what you did is saying traffic from this internal device 192.168 dot the rest of that is allowed external access to this port on port 22. If you say you told your router to do this, then anytime this IP address wants to make an SSH connection, which is port 22, to this device is not on your home network. So if you didn't set up this firewall rule, as soon as you go to try and make an SSH connection to it, your router is going to tell you no, like I'm not going to allow the connection. So that's why you need to set up rules that allow or disallow it. Because typically stuff like this would just be denied or disallowed from the get go. So you have to go in and enable it. Some common ports, if you're looking at your firewall rules and you're like customizing them, changing them, common ones that you usually want to keep open. These two are very important, port 80, port 443. These involve HTTP and then the secure HTTP. This is what you see at the beginning of every URL that you search. So every firewall keeps these open, as well as they keep your SMTP. This is for email. Another one I mentioned is SSH. DNS is used for getting the IP addresses of domain names such as google.com. So these are some typical ports that your firewall will allow access inside, outside the network, depending on how it's configured. And then most other ports, there's thousands of different ports. Pretty much every other one on a general like home router is going to be blocked.
Hey
There's a
Solomon,
few.
sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, can I share my screen?
Yeah.
I wanted to share um, one image I found online, which shares the common ports. So you have the common ones that you said: SSH. You got DNS 153. HTTPS is somewhere. Yeah, it should be like around the 400s. But some other ones here, like for example, 3724 is used for World of Warcraft. There's Xbox Live, My Doom, Internet Radio. You got the proxy right here for HTTP. You got VMware server. So basically, there are a lot of services out there which use a common port, and they basically they don't like dictate which ports are like, oh, I took this port, okay, you can't use it anymore. Ports are just a number. The sockets are where the actual data gets sent through. And so this is just a image I wanted to share. Thank you, Solomon.
Yeah, and thanks for showing that. Okay, so let me come back here. Okay. Can you all see this again? Okay, so moving on from actually before I talk about vulnerabilities, this was where I was going to share how to go ahead and access your firewall rules on your home network. So, I'll put this link in the chat. This is just a WikiHow. One of the like it just explains it really simple, so I thought it would be useful to show.
Sometimes, if you have an antivirus, their firewall rules are managed by your actual antivirus. So you have to look up how to check or how to modify those via your antivirus.
Yeah. And that's what I was mentioning earlier in like the what is it, firewall versus antivirus. You may have both your firewall turned on your PC and your antivirus, so they might be conflicting if you don't recognize that. So, looking at this WikiHow page, the first method is for those that are on PC. If you would like to check your firewall settings, go down to Start, search Firewall, open Windows Firewall, and there you go. These are your settings. I believe if you want to change your rules, then you come to Advanced Settings over on the left. And then this gives you the ability to come in here and add your ports and IP addresses that you want to allow, the ones that you want to disallow. I don't really have much more information to share on this since I'm not using a PC at this moment. But if we move on to MacBook, the thing I was finding about MacBooks is their firewall is turned off by default. And the reason for this is the same reason that Linux doesn't have a firewall included. It's just that they use a Unix based system and they don't typically keep a bunch of ports open that will compromise you. So they just go the route of not giving you the option to turn it on, but keeping it turned off as default. But for those on Mac that want to turn on their firewall for their personal computer, you can go to System Preferences, Security and Privacy, come over to Firewall, and then click the lock. Actually, I can just show it straight from my device. So let me come back up here. Are you guys able to see my settings page?
No.
Okay, so let me stop sharing then and then fix that. Okay, how about now?
Yeah, we can see it.
All right, so if you're on a MacBook, come down to security and privacy, then your firewall is most likely going to be like this, turned off by default. You'll have to put your admin stuff in to gain access, then you can turn it on. And for most people, if they just want the extra protection, they can just do that and they're fine because within firewall options, which is what you would use to add and block things, they set it up pretty in or it's set up for like the average user. So what they have checked is you can allow all built-in software to receive incoming connections. This just means that like any software that's by Apple that they know is secure, they're not going to block anything through the firewall because you'll need access to outside connections. Another one is they make sure to what is that? For signed software, they make sure to allow receiving or to allow incoming connections. Um, Down here at the very bottom, you can enable stealth mode, which basically means that if you're ever using terminal, there's a lot of IP like debugging software that you use through terminal, like ping and ICMP. ICMP is, I believe, their debug IP packets. So say you send out a packet and it fails, it sends an ICMP back showing like what IP addresses were involved and what went wrong. You can enable stealth mode, which means that people can't ping your device. So if I turn this on, it means that someone on my home network no longer can ping my device and get a reaction from it. It's going to be blocked by my firewall. If you look at the very top here, you can block all incoming connections. And I wouldn't recommend turning this on. But then if we come down here to the add button, this is where you can block certain apps or allow certain apps. See, I don't have BitTorrent installed, but I saw a pretty good example of someone taking BitTorrent and disallowing it on the firewall. So let me just pretend like I'll use voice memos since I don't think anyone ever uses this anymore. Add voice memos, block incoming connections. And so if there was a way for anyone to do an incoming connection to voice memos, my firewall on this specific laptop is going to block it. If this was an application that was more like crucial to your security, like BitTorrent, you wouldn't want BitTorrent allowing incoming connections unless you're using it at that moment. So I was seeing that people will come in here, block BitTorrent, and then when they want to use it to download something, they'll come in and allow it just for security. You can do all other sorts of apps. And this is also used to add, you can add certain services. Currently, I was trying to figure this out, but I couldn't really find much of them. But things like it allows you to block incoming Bluetooth connections. There's a lot of stuff you can find in here to allow and block. And yeah. So that's how you do that on MacBook. Are there any questions? If not, I'm going to do this last slide about vulnerabilities and then we'll be done for today's workshop. All right. So if you look over here on the right, this is what's called the OSI model. It's basically just a model that diagrams how people should set up their network structure. You don't need to know too much about it at this point, but up here at the top is layer 7, the application layer, and this is if someone's creating just like if you think of an application like Zoom, Skype, Google Chrome, Firefox, these are all applications, but then also the underlying services that allow those to work. these are held at the application level. And for firewall that aren't next generation firewalls, they have an issue where someone can just spoof the IP address. Say that you allow a certain IP address internal connection on every single port. If someone finds that IP address, they could just say, "Hey, I am that IP address, let me in." And your firewall is going to allow it because it's just told if this is the IP address, allow it in. So on these NGFW next gen firewalls that are more and more common nowadays, they do what's called a layer 7 deep packet inspection. Basically, on the top level, application level, it's going to check the packet and see, is there something suspicious in here, or is this really the person that they're saying they are? And this has helped protect against a lot of spoofing attacks. Another vulnerability that you need to understand, especially if you're creating a business, is internal attacks. The firewall is meant to protect outside people from getting in, as well as, in most cases, protect you from accessing outside resources that you're not allowed to. But this doesn't prevent someone from inside messing with your firewall settings. So you can have an internal attack where someone manipulates, changes your firewall rules, or they just bypass them with some tool. So you need to be aware that your firewall doesn't protect everything. You have to remember to check your internal infrastructure, make sure no one's being malicious. And another one is outdated software. On a home network, this isn't as big of an issue, but you should check your router at least like every 6 months to see if there's any like big security update or a security patch for something big. That's a big exploit. For businesses, you would want to make sure you're always doing this because you don't want your systems being compromised just for not updating software. And with that, I'll go over to sources that I used and I'll answer any questions if there are any. If not, that's the end of today's workshop. So I'll wait a moment just to see if there's any questions.
I did want to ask a quick question about updating the firmware. So this is actually something I ran into when trying to update the firmware of my router, where it wouldn't allow me to update it through my ISP. And then I tried to go through the router itself, and I wasn't able to update the router through it or like the mobile app or whatever. I was wondering if there's a way that you found to update the security or the firmware in general of a router.
Yeah. I don't know too much about it, but from what I've seen, my dad's the main one that messes with my home network. So I don't really get to look at it too much, but he you can look up your router's model and then look up firmware for it and see if there's downloadable firmware, and then I believe you would plug that into your router and then do like a firmware update. I don't know if that's I don't know if that was the same thing you were mentioning, and but that's what I know of about it. I
Yeah,
can
I
look
guess I'll
more
have to.
into it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Because it was a Netgear Nighthawk, and essentially, like, so I use Xfinity for my house and for my business, and need like they don't allow you to update your, or they don't. I shouldn't say they don't allow you, but they say that we don't handle updating your modem's firmware. And then I tried to download like their app, and it wouldn't work through there either. So I was just trying to see if
Mm.
there was a way that I could do it manually.
Yeah, I'm assuming the best way to do it manually would just be look up the model and then try and find the firmware from Netgear, because yeah, I don't think most ISPs will like worry about your own home router, but it would mainly just be finding firmware updates from the actual maker of your router is your best bet. Are there any other questions about this workshop? Well, all right then. So with that, thank you all for coming. This is the end of our workshop. Hope to see you back here next week. We do these every Thursday night at 7 p.m. or 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. So thank you for coming.